Let me be direct with you right now, because what is happening at this moment on the northern border of the United States is not a diplomatic footnote. It is not a minor trade spat. It is not the kind of thing that gets resolved over a phone call and a round of golf. What is happening right now between the United States and Canada is something that historians are going to be writing about for decades. And the reason Washington is in a quiet, grinding panic about it is because the person they're dealing with didn't do what they expected. He didn't fold. He didn't smile and shake hands and make it go away. He looked at the most powerful nation on earth, the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with his own, and he said in the clearest possible terms, no. Mark Carney became Canada's Prime Minister, and almost immediately the entire strategic calculus that Washington had been operating under collapsed. Because the assumption, the deeply held, almost arrogant assumption baked into the approach coming out of this White House, was that Canada would eventually come around, that the economic pressure would be too much, that the tariffs would sting badly enough, that a new leader would be more pliable, more transactional, more willing to come to the table on terms that Washington had already written. That assumption was wrong, and the panic you're now seeing ripple through certain corridors of power in this city is the sound of people realizing they misread the room, badly. Here's what you need to understand about Mark Carney before we go any further, because this matters enormously for everything that follows. This is not a politician who came up through the traditional backrooms of Canadian party politics. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, one of the most catastrophic economic implosions in modern history, and steered that country through it so successfully that he was then recruited by the United Kingdom to go run the Bank of England during Brexit. Think about that for a moment. Canada sent its central banker to help stabilize Britain during one of the most chaotic and self-inflicted economic crises a major democracy had engineered in living memory. When the world needed someone who understood systemic financial risk, who could hold a line under pressure, who could look at a storm and not flinch, they called Mark Carney. So when this White House started running its standard playbook, economic pressure, escalating rhetoric, public humiliation, the suggestion that Canada might as well just become the 51st state, they were running that playbook against a man who has spent his entire professional career being the adult in the room during someone else's catastrophe. And if you think Washington fully appreciated that going in, the reaction since Carney took office suggests otherwise. The tariffs were the opening move, and they were brutal. The Trump administration had already begun treating Canada, America's largest trading partner, a NATO ally, the country that sent soldiers to fight alongside Americans in Afghanistan, the country that opened its airspace to grounded American flights on September 11th, as if it were an adversarial economic competitor rather than the most integrated trading partner the United States has ever had. 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, threats of broader tariffs on automobiles, the kind of economic artillery that, if you fire it at Canada, you're also firing it at every American auto worker in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania who works in a supply chain that crosses that border dozens of times before a single car rolls off the line. The economics of this were always questionable. The politics of it, though. The politics were supposed to be clean. Pressure Canada. Canada caves, win. Mark Carney did not cave. He came into office and he did something that rattled the White House in a way that pure economic defiance alone wouldn't have. He started reframing the entire relationship publicly, deliberately, with the kind of precision you'd expect from someone who spent years communicating complex financial realities to nervous markets. He told Canadians, and he said this clearly enough that there was no ambiguity, no diplomatic hedging, no, we hope to work constructively with our American friends boilerplate. He told them that the old relationship with the United States, the relationship built on deep integration and mutual trust and the assumption of good faith, was over. Not paused, not strained, over. and that Canada needed to build a new economic future that did not depend on the assumption that Washington would behave like a reliable partner. That is an extraordinary statement. That is the leader of Canada standing up and telling his country and the world that the foundational assumption of North American economic integration, the assumption that has underpinned NAFTA, CUSMA, decades of trade policy, billions in cross-border investment, is no longer operative. And he said it not in anger, not as a campaign slogan, but as a policy diagnosis. A former central banker telling you the structural conditions have changed. That is not someone you can wait out. That is not someone who is posturing for domestic political consumption and will quietly walk it back after the cameras turn off. Washington noticed. And here is where it gets interesting, because the reaction was not the confident dismissal you might expect from an administration that had spent months projecting maximum dominance in every direction. The reaction was something closer to recalibration. Suddenly, there were signals about potential negotiations. Suddenly, there was talk about the tariffs being reviewed. The volume on the 51st state rhetoric, which had been turned up to an almost absurdist level, was dialed back. Not eliminated, not abandoned, but noticeably modulated. That is not what dominance looks like. That is what second-guessing looks like. And if you think that's where this ends, it's not. Because the Carney defiance is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening at a moment when America's relationships with its closest allies are under a strain that has no real modern precedent. And Canada is not just any ally. Canada is the country that shares a 5,500-mile border with the United States, that is part of NORAD, that is bound to America by geography and economics and history in ways that no tariff schedule can simply dissolve. When Canada, of all countries, Canada, starts openly planning for an economic future that roots around American dependency, that is a signal that travels. It travels to Brussels. It travels to Tokyo. It travels to every capital where leaders are quietly watching to see how far this goes and whether anyone can actually push back. Mark Carney is pushing back. And Washington is watching a script it wrote for a different actor get thrown off the stage. Stay with me. Because what happened next is the part they didn't expect anyone to notice. The thing about Canada that Americans have never quite reckoned with honestly is that we have spent so long assuming the relationship that we stopped actually examining it. There is a particular kind of blindness that comes with being the larger, louder, more militarily dominant partner in any relationship. You start to confuse familiarity with control. You start to assume that because the other party has always accommodated you, because they have always found a way to make the partnership work, because they have smiled through the difficult moments and found diplomatic language for their frustrations, that this accommodation is permanent, that it is structural, that it will simply continue regardless of how you behave. That is not a relationship. That is an assumption. And assumptions, as any good central banker will tell you, are the thing that blows up first when the conditions change. The conditions have changed. But to understand why Carney's defiance hits Washington so differently than defiance from, say, France or Germany, countries that have pushed back against American pressure before and been managed, absorbed, diplomatically neutralized, you have to understand what Canada actually represents in the architecture of American power. And this requires going back, not ancient history, recent history, the kind of history that the people in this administration either didn't study or have chosen to forget. When the United States built the post-World War II international order, the Order of Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, the whole elaborate institutional scaffolding that American power erected over the ruins of a war-destroyed world, Canada was not a passive beneficiary. Canada was a co-architect. Canada was in the room. Canadian diplomats helped draft the United Nations Charter. A Canadian, John Peters Humphrey, was the principal drafter of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Lester Pearson, a Canadian, won the Nobel Peace Prize for essentially inventing modern United Nations peacekeeping during the Suez Crisis of 1956, a crisis, incidentally, that involved managing American and British imperial impulses that were threatening to destabilize the entire post-war order. Canada has spent the better part of 80 years being the country that shows up to build and maintain the institutions that make international cooperation possible. This is not a small thing. This is the entire project. So when Mark Carney stands up in 2025 and says the foundational assumptions of the Canada-US relationship are no longer operative, he is not just a prime minister complaining about tariffs. He is the steward of a country that helped build the world America claimed to be leading. And he is saying, publicly and on the record, that American leadership as currently constituted is no longer something Canada can rely on. That is a verdict, not a grievance. And the difference matters enormously. Now here is where the historical parallel becomes almost uncomfortably precise. In 1971, Richard Nixon, under pressure from a deteriorating economic situation, a dollar weakened by Vietnam War spending, and a political need to demonstrate strength and control, unilaterally abandoned the Bretton Woods system. He took the United States off the gold standard without consulting a single allied government. He imposed a 10% surcharge on all imports. He did it by surprise. He did it unilaterally. And he did it to countries that were, on paper, America's closest allies, including Canada, including Japan, including the Western European nations that had rebuilt their economies within a framework the United States had designed and guaranteed. The reaction from those countries was not just economic alarm. It was a kind of stunned disbelief. The phrase that circulated through Allied capitals at the time was that America had treated its partners not as allies but as subjects. That what Nixon had done was not policy disagreement but betrayal. Canada was particularly exposed in 1971 because of the deep integration of its economy with the American economy, an integration that had been deliberately cultivated, that Canadian policymakers had accepted on the premise of good faith partnership, and that suddenly looked like a vulnerability rather than a strength. Sound familiar? It should. Because what Carney is doing right now, the deliberate, methodical project of reducing Canadian economic dependency on the United States, is in many ways the response that Canadian leaders in 1971 wished they had been positioned to make but weren't. He is trying to build the off-ramps that don't exist yet because he has looked at the current moment and concluded as a matter of professional judgment that the United States under this administration is exhibiting the same pattern. Unilateralism, surprise, the treatment of allies as leverage rather than partners, the abandonment of good faith as an operating principle. And he is not wrong about the pattern. But here is what makes this moment different from 1971, and this is the part that I think gets lost in the day-to-day coverage of tariff percentages and trade deficit numbers. In 1971, Nixon's economic shock was damaging and destabilizing, but it did not come packaged with a sustained ideological assault on the very idea of the alliance relationship. Nixon wanted to renegotiate the terms of American economic dominance. He did not want to dismantle the system. He was, in the end, still committed to the basic architecture of American-led Western alliance, because that architecture was the primary instrument of American competition with the Soviet Union. The Cold War logic constrained even Nixon's most destructive impulses. There was a floor. There were guardrails. Everyone understood that certain things could not be done because the Soviets were watching, and the alliance could not be seen to collapse. Those guardrails are not functioning the same way today. The ideological framework that once constrained the most destabilizing impulses of American power has been deliberately undermined. And Canada, sitting on that 5,500-mile border, woven into the American economy at every level, dependent on NORAD for its own air defense, hosting American military infrastructure on its soil, Canada is looking at this situation with a clarity that Washington seems genuinely unable to muster about itself. What Carney has understood, and what his public statements have been designed to communicate, is that this is not a negotiating posture. This is not a temporary disruption that gets resolved when cooler heads prevail or when the political winds shift. He is treating it as a structural change in the international environment, which means Canada's response has to be structural as well. You don't respond to a structural change with a tactical adjustment. You rebuild. The trade diversification push that Carney's government has accelerated, the deepening of trade relationships with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, with Indo-Pacific partners, is not new in conception. Canadian governments have talked about reducing American dependency for decades. What is new is the urgency. What is new is the explicit public acknowledgement that this is being done not as an aspiration, but as a necessity. Not as an enhancement of existing relationships, but as a hedge against the failure of the most important one. That shift in framing is significant. It tells the world something about how Canada has assessed its situation, and it tells Washington something it apparently did not want to hear. Because here is the thing about Canada's position in the global economy that the tariff conversation tends to obscure. Canada is not simply a trading partner that sends lumber and oil and automobiles south across the border. Canada is an energy superpower. Canada holds the third largest proven oil reserves in the world, after Venezuela and Saudi Arabia. Canada is a critical minerals powerhouse at the exact moment when the global competition for critical minerals, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, the rare earth elements that are the building blocks of the clean energy transition and the advanced defense technologies of the 21st century, is intensifying in ways that make the oil shocks of the 1970s look quaint. When Carney talks about Canada charting its own course, he is talking about a country that holds resources that the United States genuinely needs. That is not a minor negotiating chip. That is a fundamental leverage point. And Washington, apparently, did not fully price that in before starting this fight. Stay with me, because what the documents and the decisions of the past several weeks reveal about who actually has the leverage here is the part that turns this story completely on its head. Here is where we have to slow down and look carefully at what has actually happened. Not the rhetoric, not the press releases, not the social media volleys, but the actual sequence of decisions and their downstream consequences. Because when you lay them out in order, when you trace the timeline of what this administration did and what it triggered in response, a picture emerges that is almost the opposite of the one Washington was trying to project. This was supposed to be a demonstration of American economic dominance. It has become something else entirely. It has become a case study in what happens when you apply maximum pressure to a partner who turns out to have more options than you assumed and more resolve than you planned for. Let's start with the tariffs themselves, because the actual mechanics of what these tariffs do to the American economy have been systematically underreported in the coverage of this fight. The 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum did not land in Canada and stop there. They traveled. They traveled down the supply chains that connect the two economies at thousands of points. The auto parts that cross the border 6, 7, 8 times before they're assembled into a finished vehicle, the construction materials that go into American infrastructure projects, the aluminum that goes into American aerospace and defense manufacturing. Canadian aluminum alone accounts for roughly half of all the aluminum the United States imports. When you tariff Canadian aluminum at 25%, you are not punishing Canada in isolation. You are raising costs for every American manufacturer who uses that aluminum. You are raising prices for American consumers. You are doing this while simultaneously trying to reshore American manufacturing, which requires, here is the part that should make your head hurt, the very metals and materials you are now making more expensive to import. The automakers understood this immediately. The auto industry, which is perhaps the single most deeply integrated cross-border industry in North American economic history, moved quickly to start quantifying what these tariffs meant in practice. The numbers were not small. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis. These companies have supply chains that were deliberately constructed over decades on the premise of open cross-border trade. A tariff wall in the middle of that supply chain is not an inconvenience. It is an engine of cost and disruption that runs continuously, every day, through every vehicle they produce. Industry analysts started putting out estimates of thousands of dollars in additional costs per vehicle. the automakers started making public statements, which automakers almost never do about policy in this way, because the stakes were high enough that silence was no longer an option. And Carney watched all of this. He watched it, and he did not blink. Because here is what a former central banker understands that a pure political operator might not, when your opponent is inflicting damage on themselves in the process of trying to pressure you, the most powerful thing you can do is hold your position and let the math work. You don't have to win the argument. You just have to not lose before the other side's own internal contradictions force a recalibration. That is not a passive strategy. That is a disciplined one. And it requires a kind of institutional nerve that is genuinely rare in political leadership. But Carney did not just hold. He moved. And the moves he made in the first weeks of his government tell you everything about how he has framed this fight strategically. The announcement of accelerated trade talks with the European Union, building on the existing CETA agreement, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement that Canada and the EU finalized after years of negotiation, sent a specific message. It said that Canada was not waiting to see how the American situation resolved. It was actively building alternative architecture. The conversations with the United Kingdom about deepening the post-Brexit bilateral trade relationship sent the same message. The engagement with Japan, South Korea, and Australia, all countries that are simultaneously navigating their own complex relationships with an increasingly unpredictable Washington, sent the message that Canada was not isolated in this posture, that there was a coalition of the cautious forming, countries that had built their security and prosperity on the assumption of American reliability and were now quietly, methodically beginning to hedge. This is the part they didn't expect anyone to notice. Because individually, each of these diplomatic conversations looks like routine trade policy. Canada talks to the EU, Canada talks to the UK, Canada engages with Indo-Pacific partners. These are things Canadian governments have done for years. But the timing, the sequencing, the explicit public framing of these conversations as a response to American unreliability, that is new. That is Carney using the tools of conventional diplomacy to send an unconventional signal. He is telling every capital that is watching this situation that Canada has assessed the American partnership as structurally compromised and that it is acting on that assessment. And because Canada carries enormous credibility in these conversations, because it is not a country with a history of inflammatory rhetoric or destabilizing unilateralism, because it is precisely the kind of steady, institution-building, rules-following partner that other democracies trust, when Canada says the American relationship is broken, people listen, people believe it. It lands differently than if France said it, or China, or anyone with an obvious axe to grind. Now let's talk about the critical minerals piece, because this is where the leverage question gets genuinely acute. The global race for critical minerals is one of the defining geopolitical competitions of the next several decades. The clean energy transition requires enormous quantities of lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earth elements. The advanced defense and technology sectors, semiconductors, missile guidance systems, electric vehicle batteries, grid-scale energy storage require the same materials. China currently dominates the processing and refining of many of these minerals in ways that have become a serious national security concern for the United States and its allies. The American response to this challenge has been to try to build alternative supply chains, to source these materials from friendly, reliable, rule-of-law countries that are not going to weaponize supply as a geopolitical tool. Canada is, on paper, the single most important partner in that project. Canada has vast deposits of the critical minerals the United States needs. Canada has the geological surveys, the mining expertise, the environmental regulatory frameworks, the political stability, and the geographic proximity to be the cornerstone of any serious American strategy to reduce dependence on Chinese critical mineral supply chains. The Canadian government under previous administrations had been actively developing this partnership, investing in the infrastructure and the regulatory environment to accelerate critical minerals extraction and processing. explicitly positioning Canada as America's most important ally in this specific strategic competition. And then Washington started a trade war with Canada.